To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the fully and completely awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and humans, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and humans, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. When, O supreme among humans, you were born on this earth, you paced out 7 strides and said, I am supreme in this world. To you who are wise then I prostrate. With form bodies, form supremely pure, wisdom motion like a golden mountain, fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best, Lord, to you I prostrate. With the supreme signs, face like spotless moon, color like gold, to you I prostrate. Dust free like you, the 3 worlds are not, incomparably wise one, to you I prostrate. Savior, having great compassion, the fount having all understanding, field of merit with qualities like a vast ocean, to you, the one God of thusness, I prostrate. The purity that frees one from attachment, the virtue that frees one to lower realms, the one path, the sublime pure reality, the Dhamma pacifies, I prostrate. Those who are liberated and also show the path to liberation, the holy field qualified with realizations, who are devoted to the moral precepts, to you, the sublime community intending virtue, I prostrate. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all 3 offer devout homage. To all those to all worthy of respect, bowing with bodies, as many as all atoms, realms, atoms in all aspects, with supreme faith I pay homage. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly, this is the teaching of the Buddha. A star of his elaboration, a lamp, flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew, or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see conditioned things as such. Through these merits may sentient beings attain the rank of all seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. I prostrate to the Arya triple gem. Thus did I hear at one time that Bhagavan was dwelling in a massive vulture's mountain in Grajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagavan was absorbed in the concentration on the countless categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom, and beheld those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara. How should any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage train who wishes to practice particularly the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Shariputra. Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wish to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom, should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly, holding the 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form is also not other than an emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness. No eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so up to including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on up to including no aging and death and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration, without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering should be known as a truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared, Dhyata Gate Gate, Paragate, Parasam Gate, Bodhi Soham. We have to finish the closing part of the sutra, Shanti. The last few paragraphs. Sorry. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagavan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage, it is like that. It is like that one should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated, even that the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagavan having thus spoken, the Venerable Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara, and those surrounding in their entirety, along with the worlds of gods, human Asuras, and Gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagavan. And we'll just recite the mantra again one time. Dhyata Gate Gate Paragate Parasam Gate Bodhi Soha.
This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, four continents, the sun and the moon, I imagine this as a Buddha feel and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. O holy and perfect pure Lama, from the clouds of compassion that form in the skies of your Dharmakaya wisdom, please release a rain of vast and profound dharma, precisely in accordance with the needs of those to be trained. Idam Guru Ratnam Mandalakam Niryatayami.
I go for refuge and enlightenment to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. The merits I create through listening to the Dharma, or teaching the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge and enlightenment to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. The merits I create through teaching the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge and enlightenment to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. For the merits I create through teaching the Dharma, become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Okay, so then we'll just sit quietly for a couple minutes before we begin. Okay. Again, welcome back, everybody. I hope that you've all had a good week and are safe wherever you are. Here at Serra, I think maybe I mentioned last week, we've had an outbreak for about 2.5 months now. Seems to keep going on. But now we've all received the second dose of the vaccine. So hopefully that will slow down the spread of things. Although the children, there's about 1,000 young monks in the monastery under the age of 18, and they aren't able to get the vaccine. So maybe it will keep spreading among them. It seems to be the main problem with children getting infected here. But fortunately, it's not, usually not very severe. So we're hoping that things will gradually die down, so to speak. But let's see what happens. Maybe at some point we would reopen again. It seems almost like a fantasy, but let's see what happens. But in the meantime, it's very nice to be able to do these talks online. As I said, being able to discuss this is a very helpful way for me also to think about the meaning, which is obviously not easy. So I think I've received quite a few questions this week. I responded to some of them by email, and I'll continue to respond in the next few days. I think there was at least one more that I hadn't responded to yet. So one of the common questions, really two things that seem to stand out, were about the question of, whether is thinking a problem, because we're saying that all things are merely imputed and that the mind is creating suffering. Then is the question, should we therefore not have so much conceptual thought? And then the other question was regarding how do we posit what's right and wrong, or what's true and what's not true, if everything's relative or conventional. So regarding this first question of conceptual thought, that's also a major question in Buddhism. I think I mentioned that there's debates about that and different opinions about that. And also there's a popular view of Buddhism, I think, nowadays in the West, that it encourages people not to think too much about things, or just to abide in a peaceful state. And you don't want to have too much conceptual thought, because that would be an obstacle that just creates more confusion. And I would say that, certainly Tsongkhapa, founder of our school, thought that was a major wrong view. And he, traces that his sources for that back to the Indian scholars. You look at the great practitioners of India, Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, Palaviveka, and these people were all incredible scholars who could explain themselves in very clear ways. So there is something to be said for the question of, you don't want to just have an intellectual understanding, and this is certainly emphasized in Buddhism as well. One thing I think of a saying of the Buddha. So a lot of you probably know the Dhammapada. It's often translated in English, the Dhammapada, but the same text is in Tibetan. It's a little different from the Pali one, because it just, for whatever reason, it got translated differently or passed down differently, but mostly it's the same. So it's called Tsom in Tibetan. And so there's one quote saying from the Buddha. He says, I am alone, my guardian. I am alone, my refuge source. Just as I tame a wild horse, more so than that, I train myself. So he says, he compares our mind to a wild horse that is untamed. And the goal of the practice is to tame the horse, to gain control over it. So I think that's a very good analogy, because if our mind is completely out of control, this is dangerous. And it's probably better not to think too much, in some sense, that it's good at that point. We do things like meditating on the breath, where the mind can start to calm down and not always be out of control. But if we think about the example of a wild horse, it's true. If we have a wild horse, we want first to stop it from running around. But at the same time, just having a horse that stands still all the time is not very useful. That's not the purpose of training a horse. What you want to do with the horse is to be able to control it and have it, when you want it to run fast, it runs fast. And when you want it to go to the right, it goes to the right. And when you want it to turn around, it turns around. And when you want it to slow down, it slows down. So this is what we want to train our minds to be able to do. And this is part of why we engage in study also. That at a certain level, yes, we want to be able to stop all these wild thoughts, but we also want to train to be able to use our thoughts in a very focused way, where we can still be very controlled and calm in an inner sense, yet be able to debate and be able to think about things and question what is real, because this is really the way to be liberated. We can't just be liberated from not doing anything and stopping thought entirely. We just have, the point is to be able to do that in a way that is not detrimental, where our mind takes control of us. And we'll see on one of the last slides, won't come today for certain, but later in the course, Nagarjuna actually gives this example of a horse, that one's own conceptions of things, one's own ideas, become like a horse that is out of control and carries you all over the place. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama also has mentioned, in terms of this question, we see examples of masters who, the teacher slaps the student on the head with a sandal. This was what Tilopa did to Naropa in India, and then he's enlightened. So it sounds like it's anti-intellectualism. You look at Naropa, and he was the abbot of Nalanda, but he left behind the monastery and followed Tilopa, who was a beggar, who did all kinds of crazy things, and then finally hit him in the head, and he was enlightened. So it sounds like it's saying you shouldn't be this scholastic abbot. You should do all these crazy things, and then you'll get enlightened. But His Holiness said that really misunderstanding the point of the tradition. That it's not irrelevant that Tilopa was the abbot of Nalanda. He had trained himself for many, many years to get to that position, and then at a certain point, his mind needed to transcend that. And so at that point, he was ready for the kind of teachings that Tilopa was giving him. And His Holiness said it's the same with the Zen tradition. So people think that in the Zen tradition, it's just about not thinking, but this is something that comes at a very advanced level, when the person has already trained their mind to such an extent that they no longer need to consciously make effort to think about the meaning. It's just a natural, say, second nature. And at this point, it just takes a little shove, an extra shove, to wake them up. But it's not as though that's going to work for everybody. And His Holiness says that oftentimes you'll see these pith instructions where somebody says one pithy word, like one phrase that's it just gets right to the heart of it. What is emptiness? But he says that such a phrase is only really useful for a particular person at a particular time. So for most people to hear that, it's not really going to be that beneficial. That's why we study all of these texts, because these are much more clear. They explicate exactly what this all means, which for the average person, it's a lot more accessible. And even as I say, it's not just that there are certain special people where you just say one word. If that's the case, the person must have trained a lot before. His Holiness says that there's no person who in either this life or a past life never trained in anything, and then just simply one word will get them enlightened. That's simply not possible. But in certain cases, depending on the person's capacity, different teachings might be beneficial. But generally speaking, the best approach is to follow what we look at the great Indian masters and what they did, which was to learn very clearly all of the different teachings. So that's the first question. And the other question about how do we posit what's true and what's, within a system where everything is relative, or what can be posited as right and wrong, and what is the system saying? So that will, I hope, become more clear today, actually, with today's talk about the no thesis view, which is something that's becomes a theme within this first section. So the first section of the first debate is about say meaning, How does empty words, when you say that everything's empty, how do your words have any meaning? That's exactly the question that Nagarjuna is responding to. And then there's this question of what is meant by having no thesis. So that I will go into quite a digression about that today. And also, there's probably more to it. I think not all the questions are going to be answered today by any means. It'll also be more if epistemology is a second subject, which might come today, but most likely we'll cover tomorrow. And this also addresses some of those same issues. And also, I think I will try to respond more by email to some of the questions. But it's obviously not something that can be just clearly explained in a short time. This is a very deep question. Somebody once said that the text Essence of Eloquence, which is often considered Tsongkhapa's greatest explication of emptiness, really the whole point of this 250-page text is to explain how you can posit a system of cause and effect when everything's empty. And it just goes through what the mind-only school says and what the autonomy school of middle way says, and then finally what Chandrakirti and the consequentialists say is the main part of the text, and showing how they posit this. So the themes from that will come up today. And as I say, if certain particular things don't get addressed, then of course I'm happy to continue answering questions. So with that, let's come back to the slides. Let's see. Okay, so this is where we left off last week. I'm sure you remember. So last week we had the introductory topics. First we had the 6 different examples of emptiness, which I said are good to keep in mind because I might refer back to those. And then we had the first introductory topic about the philosophy of language, which is what today's subject within the text will certainly be related to. So that's why I had the introductory topic. And then about philosophy of mind, which is related to the second topic in the text. So you recall that I presented various popular philosophies of mind today. There's still a major question about what is the nature of mind. It's not something that there's any agreement on in the scientific community in the way that we agree on things like, for example, photosynthesis. We pretty much know what photosynthesis is. There are obviously many questions about details of it, but why is it that plants grow and how do they nourish themselves? We have a pretty good paradigm of how that works. Whereas with the mind, it's nothing like that at all. There's many different ideas about it, but there's certainly no one paradigm that's generally accepted. And most people who really understand the field will admit that we don't really have any idea. But as I said, most of them, or almost all of the mainstream philosophers, are of the opinion that the mind is a product of the brain. This is the dominating paradigm today. Probably for a number of reasons. I think it's very useful if you're really interested to look historically how that came about. But as I mentioned, especially that there was the view of Descartes, which is dualism, which is the mind is a completely different phenomenon than the brain that isn't related, or not to just the brain, but to material things, and is in some sense a very coarse idea of dualism. So a lot of philosophy of mind since the 18th century has been intending to reject that view because that's seen as antithetical to science. It doesn't work. And so there's a very strong bias against dualism. And then I think also very strongly because science has grown away from Christianity, that science initially was within Christianity, but eventually broke away from it. And there's a strong bias against anything that sounds like a religious view, which believing in a non-material mind is often classed as such. But that will definitely come up because certainly, as I said, in Nagarjuna's view, the mind is a non-material thing. And we'll discuss that and what Nagarjuna's view on that is. It's quite interesting because I mentioned, and I'll mention this book quite a bit more today, this Dispeller of Disputes by Jan Westerhoff, I said is the translation both of the root text and the commentary, and also with his own commentary. Westerhoff, as far as I can tell, he's a scholar at Oxford and University of London. He's a traditionally Western trained philosopher, but who also has learned very well the system of Nagarjuna. But it seems, again, if you read between the lines, it seems to me that he also is quite of the opinion that the mind is by definition, a product of the brain, and seems to take that as almost for granted. So he seems to be a little bit put off by Nagarjuna's in claiming that that material things do not exist without mind. So that will come up. But it's interesting that he specifically says he thinks maybe that's not what he meant, what Nagarjuna meant. But again, it seems that there's a bit of a bias towards it. But certainly, if we look at Chandrakirti's interpretation of Nagarjuna, which is what we, as I have said, will be taking as authoritative. This is what Tsongkhapa takes as authoritative interpretation. It does not believe in the mind-only system, which is the idea that everything is mind. But at the same time, it certainly does not affirm the idea that it's simply a physical world. Chandrakirti rather believes that it's not. You can't say that either mind or physicality is predominant. You can't say one exists without the other, but they depend on each other. So certainly in Chandrakirti's system, there's no such thing as a material world without a mind experiencing it. And how that specifically comes up within this text is in the question of self-cognition, and whether mind is aware of itself. And so I was mentioning that is also an issue in modern cognitive science. And here we have Nicholas Humphrey, this was our last slide, basically defining mind as awareness of mind, which I said is a bit of a problematic definition. But even so, that is certainly something that will be disputed in this text. And saying that the subject of consciousness are conscious of merely mental states, perceptions, memories, wishes, and so on, just insofar as you know about them by looking into your own mind. So he says, I define consciousness as introspective access to mental states. Okay. So as I said in the first talk at the beginning, that this text is one of the Sixfold Collection of reasoning, which are the six main texts of Nagarjuna about emptiness. The main one of which is root wisdom. So far, I've taught courses on 3 of these texts, the 70 stanzas on emptiness, which is a response to a debate that comes up in the 7th chapter of root wisdom. And then the 60 stanzas on reasoning, which is an independent text. It's not based on a particular chapter of root wisdom, but it's rather main thrust of that text to show that it's necessary to realize emptiness, to be liberated, that there are different schools of thought, and some think that although emptiness is a genuine teaching of the Buddha, that it wasn't actually necessary for us to meditate on that if we want to achieve liberation. And that text is showing that that's not the case, and that actually, really, if we look at what the Buddha was teaching, even in the early teachings, like the Four Noble Truths that he gave, the teaching he gave at Deer Park, his first teaching, actually he was teaching about emptiness. If we really look at the meaning of what was being said, even though other schools interpret it that way, he shows how if you interpret it that way, it doesn't actually work logically to understand what the Buddha was saying. And then there's this text, the Dispelling Dispute, which is it branches off from the first chapter, and I'll explain that here. And then, as I mentioned, the text really, which should be called Crushing to Dust, I had mentioned before as finely woven, but it seems that's not actually what it means. It should be called Crushing to Dust, which is also an independent text about systems of logic. And then the text, The Precious Garland, which is a text of advice to a king, which is much more focused on practice and the method side of things, but also has a number of sections on emptiness. So the main text of all of these is certainly root wisdom. And it will be good maybe at some point to do a course on that, but it's not something I can just do in a weekend course like we're doing with these. Root wisdom, it probably would take an entire semester to go through it properly. So maybe someday in the future, if that such a thing becomes possible. But in the meantime, we'll have these smaller texts. And so we see with root wisdom, the very first chapter, except in fact, really the first verses of the text, because I have here, you see verses chapter 1, verses 3 to 5. But some of you who actually have a translation, you might see these same verses listed as 1 to 3, because before this, there are 2 verses of homage, which may or may not be actually classed as numbers within the chapter, because they're kind of the introduction to the entire text. But in any case, these are the first verses that deal with philosophy of emptiness. So we have Nagarjuna first starts his text by saying, not from itself, nor other, nor from both of them, nor causelessly. No thing at all in any way is ever born at any time. So just briefly, Nagarjuna is here using what we call the diamond slivers argument, which means examining 4 extremes that would have, one of which would have to be entailed if things existed inherently. If it was possible to pinpoint one thing being born from another, then the 2 things would either have to be the same, meaning that it's born from itself, or it's born from something other than it, which means something completely unrelated to it, or it's born from both, so it's born both from something that's the same as it and from something other unrelated, or it's born causelessly, there's no cause at all. And no thing at all in any way, so in any way means by any system of reasoning you could imagine, is ever born at any time. So neither in the past, nor in the present, nor in the future does that happen in any of these ways. Now, somebody might object, well, why does something have to be born in one of those 4 ways? If we say things are born, and Nagarjuna does agree, okay, things in general on a conventional level are born, why does it have to be in those 4 ways? So this is actually one of what will come up today. But the point basically is that if you have to pinpoint it, if you agree that it has to be able to be something you can locate. So when we talk about the referent for the term birth, if you can pinpoint exactly what birth is, the referent for the term being independent of our way of conceiving of it, then it would have to be one of those ways, because it has to be something we can pinpoint as one or the other. Whereas if it exists as a mere convention, it doesn't have to be any of those 4. So that in that way it can still function. So as I said, that will come up within the dispelling disputes. So then in the 4th verse, this is actually an opponent responding. So in quotations, this is somebody listing, well, of course, you said just things that you just said that nothing is ever born. But then I say, this is quoting, he's also quoting the Buddha. It's not a literal quote, but it's paraphrasing what the Buddha often taught. There's 4 conditions, causes and observed and just preceding ones, empowering as well, just those. A 5th condition needn't apply. So he's saying that there are 4 different conditions that the Buddha specified. So for example, if we have an eye consciousness perceiving blue, this is the commonly given example, there has to be 4 different conditions that lead to that occurrence. So in our interpretation anyway, Tsongkhapa's interpretation, the causal condition, the first one, is really just a general statement, so it subsumes the other 3. So really it's 3 conditions that have to apply, that are all causal conditions. So there has to be the observed condition, the just preceding condition, and the empowering condition. So the observed condition, if it's blue, is the color blue. There has to be an external color blue for my having an eyesight perceiving blue. It can't just arise, causelessly. Of course, I could have a hallucination of blue, but that's a different question. Here we're talking about a correct consciousness perceiving blue. There has to be an external form that then casts its aspect and contacts the eye. So that's the eye, or really the eye sense power is how it's understood, is called the empowering condition. It's because without the power of the eye, you can't see things. It's what empowers you, it empowers consciousness to experience visual forms. And then there has to be the just preceding condition, which means consciousness. So this is something that's different, again, from a materialist view, that just because there's an eye and an external form does not mean there will be a consciousness of perceiving the form, because there also has to be consciousness, which is not a physical thing. So just proceeding in the sense that there has to be just a preceding moment of consciousness, which then, through the causal connection of the observed condition and the empowering condition, then generates an experience of blue. So this is called contact. If any of you know the 12 links of dependent origination, the sixth link is contact. That is the contact between these three, between consciousness empowered by either a sense power or the mind sense power, which allows it to think and to have conscious non-sensorial experience, and the observed condition, something that appears to mind. So just those, a fifth condition needn't apply. There doesn't need to be anything more than that. So the Buddha said that. So then he said that things arise from causes. So how can you possibly say that nothing is ever born at any time? So then Nagarjuna responds in verse 5, the nature of all things is not found in conditions and so on. If one's own nature doesn't exist, another's nature also can't. So he says that there's no nature found within things. This is the important point. So if you want to say that nothing is ever born, what he's saying is nothing is ever born that is you can pinpoint. When we say nature, this is the key point. Nature is what we call inherent existence. It means something that exists independently of our way of conceiving of it. Something that if you search among the basis of designation of the thing, that you can find something that constitutes the thing you're looking for. So when we talk about birth, so for example, a sprout arising from a seed, you can pinpoint specifically what is birth. If you have, for example, a slow camera that films this sprout coming from the seed over a period of 5 days, you can pinpoint exactly, here's the nanosecond when it was born, where it's no longer a seed and now it's a sprout. So it was either the seed was one thing and the sprout is another. So that would be that it's born from something else. So at time 1.1, it's a seed. And then at time 1.2, there's no longer a seed and there's a sprout. So it's like the seed disappears and the sprout appears. That's not how it happens. But if there was a nature, that would be how it has to happen. So it's not found in conditions. You can't find it. So if one's own nature doesn't exist, then another's nature also can't. So if there's nothing found, then there can't be birth from other as well. So this verse right here is the basis for the entire text, Dispelling Disputes. It responds to this one verse. We have 71 verses of Dispelling Disputes. So Dispelling Disputes, as you say, it's plural, because there are actually 9 disputes that are given. As I mentioned at the end of the talk last week, the structure of the text is such that the first 20 verses are the disputes. So the opponent just gives 9 different consequences or problems with this verse. And then there's 50 responses to that. So 50 verses responding. So it's divided up, I don't know the exact numbers, but say we have 1 to 20. So say the first 5 verses are the first dispute, because that's actually more substantial than the other ones. Then we'd have 7 verses responding to that. Then you have 2 verses for the next dispute. And I think that's a very long response, it's about 20 verses. So it's like that, there's not any particular pattern to it. But if you read the text, it can be confusing because you have all these disputes and you have all these responses and it's not clear how they line up. So if you have the translation I sent out, it at least gives an outline. But the way I'll go through it here is to first show what's the dispute and then immediately jump to the response to that, so it's clear which ones line up with which. And as I mentioned, who is this debating? It's sort of hypothetical. It's clear that there were people who were saying these things, and I generally had identified this debater as the Nyāyā system of philosophy, which it seems that the person is adhering to that view. But also we could understand it that at this time in India, because that particular philosophy or system of logic, really, because Nyāyā is more a system of logic that was adopted by especially the Vaisheshika school, which is a philosophical school. But it wasn't only adopted by the Vedic schools. Also, there were probably many Buddhist monks who were also fascinated by this philosophy or this system of logic. So they might also have been influenced by it. So by responding to that, Nagarjuna was also responding to other Buddhists who might have been trained in this kind of logic and didn't like Nagarjuna's statement saying that nothing is born from anything. Okay, so now let's start with this spelling dispute. So dispute 1, the status of the theory of emptiness. So we have this the MADHYAMAKA dilemma, dispute 1a. So actually, this dispute I've subdivided. This is based on Jan Westerhoff's subdivisions, which are very helpful. Divided into 3 different disputes to make it a little more clear how it flows. So the very first verse here we have, if the nature of existent things is not to be found anywhere, your words as well are natureless. To counter nature, powerless. So if you got the translation I sent out, I changed the last line a little bit just to make it flow a little better. But the point here, as you see, the person is saying, if you said that nothing has a nature and is not found anywhere, then the words you said, that verse of yours that said that the nature of things not to be found anywhere is also natureless. So it has no functional efficacy. It had to counter nature, it's powerless. So you have this picture here of a man yelling into an empty space. What are your words doing? If it's all just empty, then you can't really make any argument. This is what a lot of you are asking about. If everything is relative, then what's the point of arguing about anything? Because nothing's true and nothing's false. It's all just empty. So Nagarjuna responds to this, response 1a, with 2 verses, verses 21 and 22. First, if my speech cannot be found within the causal nexus or apart from it, all things are proved as empty since no nature is found. So he's saying you've kind of backed yourself into a corner here, because you said either my words or everything is empty, including my words, in which case, okay, I agree. I already was exactly my thesis. Or you said that my words are not empty and they can negate emptiness, they can negate nature. So in either case, there's no nature. There's no inherent existence. But really what he's saying is I accept your verse, lines A, B, and C, but not D. So if we look back at the verse again, if the nature of existent things is not to be found anywhere, your words as well are natureless. I agree. Nagarjuna says that's true. What you said is true. To counter nature powerless, no, I disagree with that. I disagree with this last point. So you have this picture here, just you hear somebody speaking. So the words can't be found anywhere. You can't identify the words as existing in the teeth or the lips or the tongue or in the sound even. That the sound itself is not words. Otherwise, people who didn't understand the words would still understand them. But it requires an entire structure of understanding of language in order for it to be meaningful in any way. It's not just meaningful in and of itself independently. So then Nagarjuna says, dependently arising things are just what we call emptiness. Things that arise dependently completely lack a nature at all. So if you talk about nature or substance, I mentioned that Westerhoff chose the word substance to translate nature, which is swabhava in Sanskrit, rangjin in Tibetan, which is like its own face. So something that's substantial behind things. If you have a word, there's something existing in the world already. So the example I gave about the Garden of Eden is a very good example that it's like everything's just waiting to be named before you name it, rather than you're constructing reality through your naming process. So there's some substance that I then put the label on, but the substance is waiting for me to name it. So nature or substance would imply a bottom rung in the chain of causal reaction, so that there's something that's fundamental upon which everything else is built, as opposed to everything existing in a relation to something else and in relation to each other. So he's saying here that dependent arising is what's meant by emptiness. He makes this point again and again. Emptiness does not mean nothingness. It means that everything exists dependent on other things, and so you cannot pinpoint one thing that's fundamental and everything else builds upon that. You can't get to any point where you get down to the real essence of things. So then he gives an analogy, the phantom analogy, verse 23. One phantom stops another, or a conjured man obstructs a man. That he himself has conjured like this, negation here is done that way. So he gives two examples actually. One phantom stopping another. So my words, which are empty, stop or counter your words, which are also empty. But it does not mean that they don't stop them. So my words are right and your words are wrong. Just like a picture, you have a phantom that obstructs another phantom, and there's a battle between two phantoms and one of them wins. Or even more so, a conjured man obstructs a man that he himself has conjured. Which the idea here is that somebody conjures one phantom, and then actually the idea here is that that phantom then conjures another phantom. So there's three levels of ontology here. That there's the person who's real, you might say, conjures the phantom, which is less real, which then conjures the phantom, which is the phantom of the phantom, which is the least real of all. So this first phantom conjures a phantom and then stops it. So this is like an analogy of, although everything is the same and not existing inherently, still some views are right and some views are wrong. And so if I have a wrong view, I can counter that wrong view. It doesn't make me disappear. So the first phantom then causes the second phantom to disappear, which is like his wrong view, which is even less real. But at the same time, he's still a phantom. He's still there, but it's still not a real thing. So you see here, we are like magicians trying to dissolve our own creation. So this experience that we have is our own creation from our own way of conceiving of things. So then the disputant responds again with this, what's called the 6-point controversy. This is in the, it's not explained in the text itself, but in the auto commentary, Nagarjuna puts all these words into the mouth of the disputant based on the second verse. So, or if your words have nature, then your former thesis falls apart. If they alone are unalike, present a special reason why. So if you remember in the first verse, he said, if your words also have no nature, then they have no power to counter nature, to show that everything are not inherently existent, because they are also natureless. But if you, Nāgārjuna, were to say, well, actually, my words have nature, nothing else does, but my words do, then your former thesis falls apart. You've therefore said that something has nature. You said first nothing has nature, but then there's this one exception, there's my words. So if your words alone are a special exception, if they alone are unalike, present a special reason why. So you've made an exception to your rules, so you have to give some kind of reason for that. So that if we break this down to the 6-point controversy here, it is that first, if all things are empty, your statement is. Thus, the negation fails to be accomplished. That's one possibility. Or secondly, or if the negation is accomplished, your statement is not empty, but then its meaning fails to be accomplished. Because, okay, so you've now agreed that your statement is, it works, it's functionally sound, in which case it's not empty. But then it contradicts your saying that everything is empty, so it fails to accomplish what it's saying. Or three, or if all things are empty, but your statement is not empty, then your statement is not included among all things. So maybe you say that all things are empty, but my statement is not empty. Well, therefore, it would logically follow that my statement is not a thing, it's something else. Or four, if it is included among things, it is empty. Thus, the negation fails to be accomplished. So we're back to square one here. So you say, no, it is a thing. Okay, well, then it's empty. Okay, then it fails to do anything. Or five, or if your statement is empty, yet manages to accomplish the negation, then empty things will be causally efficacious. So this is a little different. Now he's admitting, okay, so maybe you're saying that your statement is empty, yet it has causal efficacy. But how could that work? Because if it's empty, if it has no inherence, if there's nothing there beyond our mental way of constructing it, then how could it do anything? Or six, so let's assume that things are empty and lack causal efficacy. But then your statement fails to accomplish the negation. So again, we've come back to the main point here. The only one that, if we look at this, what Nagarjuna will respond to, you might guess, is statement number 5, which is closest to what he actually accepts. But I've quoted here, this is actually, again, I'm borrowing from Westerhoff in his commentary. He gives this quote, which is very relevant. And it's also relevant to the questions a lot of you are asking. So this is an argument against the postmodernist viewpoint, which some of you might know, which is the idea of that everything is relative, global relativism, that there's no real true statements or untrue statements that exist outside of relative to a particular way of seeing things. So this is philosopher Paul Boghossian. I don't actually know him personally. I haven't read this book, Fear of Knowledge, but yeah, against relativism and constructivism. So as I mentioned in the first talk, that I think there are definitely parallels between Nagarjuna's philosophy and postmodernism, relativism, although there are also important differences. One especially, as I said, is that sometimes, at least into some extreme forms, constructivism will argue against science being able to tell us anything true about existence, which I definitely don't think Nagarjuna would agree with that. But here we have this argument. The global relativist is caught on the horns of a dilemma. Either he intends his own view to be absolutely true, or if he intends it to be only relatively true relative to some theory or other. So if the former, if he intends it to be absolutely true, then he refutes himself, because his thesis is that there is no ultimate truth. So if you say that the statement nothing is absolutely true, then you refuted yourself, because you admitted there is at least one absolute truth, that there's no absolute truth. Or the latter, if my statement is not absolutely true, then we may just ignore him, for then it is just a report of what the relativist finds agreeable to say. So if he says there's no absolute truth, and what I'm saying is also not true, then okay, I don't care what you say. What you said hasn't had any effect. It has no meaning. So this is in effect what the opponent is arguing here with Nagarjuna. So Nagarjuna responds, contesting the fifth point. My words are natureless, thereby my standpoint is consistent too. There's nothing here that's unalike. A special reason needn't apply. So again, he's saying, I agree. My words are natureless. I never disputed that. But implicitly, he's saying they still work. They still have causal efficacy. There's no need. My standpoint is consistent. My view of emptiness is consistent. There's nothing I haven't contradicted myself, and there's nothing, no special exemption here. So what is natureless can still be causally efficacious. One statement is correct, one is incorrect. So next, the sound analogy, dispute 1b. So this is again the opponent sort of acting as though he hasn't heard, because as I said, the Nagarjuna hasn't said anything yet in the text. He just presents all these disputes, and then later Nagarjuna responds to them one by one. So he's, as though Nagarjuna hadn't made a response yet, he presents a possibility. Okay, maybe you would think it's like this. So he says, if in your mind you think it's like, don't make a sound, that's incorrect. For here, a pre-existing sound prevents the one yet to arise. So maybe you think it's like saying, shh, don't make a sound. When I said don't make a sound, I just made a sound, didn't I? So am I contradicting myself? But you could say, well, I said after I say this one sound, don't make a sound. So maybe it's like you're saying, everything's empty now, from now on, after I make that first statement. But he says that's incorrect. That's not a good analogy. This example fails because sound is a real thing. So pre-existing sound that can function. It prevents something of a similar ontological status. So a sound that is yet to arise also has an existence if it were to arise. So one existent thing prevents another. Your words, on the other hand, are empty, yet purport to refute nature, something of a higher ontological status. So you have this little man trying to refute the big man here with the microphone or the megaphone. So it's like your words have no status whatsoever. You claim that your words are empty. You're trying to negate nature, which is the real way things exist. So you're trying to use something that has a lower ontological status to a higher one, as opposed to things of equal ontological status. So the response that Nagarjuna gives to this is, Don't make a sound. In this, you failed to craft an apt analogy. For there, the sound prevents a sound. The present case is not like that. If lack of nature on its own refutes the lack of nature, then, when lack of nature is reversed, a nature's thoroughly confirmed. So what he's saying in the first stanza here, I agree, this is not a good example. Sound prevents sound, something of a similar ontological status. I agree with you, that's not what's happening here. My words, on the other hand, refute nature, something of a lower ontological status, because it is completely non-existent. So actually, it's not as though my words are empty and nature is real, and my empty words are regarding an irreal thing. My words are conventionally existent, whereas nature is conventionally non-existent. So my words are more real than nature. So it's negating something of a lower ontological status. If instead my words prevented something of a similar ontological status, so if it was the case that there was in fact a thing called nature, and that by saying words, I was then causing it to not exist anymore, so then the very words lack, the things lack nature, then nature would be established. So here we have the idea that this is what we talk about a non-affirming negation. This is actually a very important stanza. It's one of the most quoted stanzas within this text. And Tsongkhapa uses it to defend his idea of emptiness as a non-affirming negation. If lack of nature on its own refutes the lack of nature, so if you say that when we say the words lack of nature, that it's actually able to refute the lack of nature, right? So if lack of nature is a thing to be negated, then there has to be a nature. So some people say that there are interpretations of Madhyamaka saying that things neither exist nor non-exist, nor both nor neither, and that's Nagarjuna's theory, because he said this idea that it doesn't come from self or other and so forth. But if that's the case, when you say things don't exist, but they also don't not exist, but by saying things don't not exist, you've then affirmed that things exist. When that's the way words work, that a negation of a negation is therefore going to cause something to, a positive phenomenon to exist, right? So if there was something, if we talk about nature, there was something already there that we were disputing, then something else would have to come in the place of that. When we say that there is a thing called lack of nature that is real, that I'm disputing, then they're going to have, when words dispute that, then nature has to come about. But it's not like that. It's simply saying that nature is impossible in any particular way. So it's outside of this system. When we say it's either exist nor non-existent nor both nor neither, that's within the idea that there has to be something findable. Either nature is here or it's locatable somewhere else. But Nagarjuna is saying it's not locatable anywhere. So it's like talking, I can describe to you something, he'll come to this point later. I can tell you that there's nothing here. It doesn't mean that it's somewhere else either. It's simply saying that your view is wrong. You have an idea of something, that thing that is in your mind, that's appearing to your mind, doesn't exist anywhere. So rather than saying, this particular person is not here, which implies that they exist somewhere else, I'm saying that this conception you have is an impossible way of existing. Things cannot exist that way, so therefore your idea is completely wrong. It doesn't have to exist here nor somewhere else. So Nagarjuna then gives another analogy that this is like a skillful means to stop a wrong view. Or like somebody wrongly deems a woman toward a phantom girl. Another phantom stops that view. Negation here is done that way. So the example that's given, this is described actually by Jitsun Shuki Geltsen, who's the author of the Sarajay textbooks. And he explicates the meaning here as being that somebody might have an illusory woman that they generate attachment for. So in order to dispel their attachment, the Buddha then emanates of an emanation, an emanation body that teaches them about the faults of attachment. And then that diminishes their attachment, and they're no longer attached to the illusion. Or really that teaches them that this is just an illusion. But the Buddha who's teaching it is also an illusion. So this is this way that negation is done here. The words are also illusory. They're no more inherently existent than your wrong view. But for the purpose of disputing the wrong view, this is how it's taught. So the idea here is that I'm not trying to get rid of a nature that exists. My target is not nature. My target is the wrong view of nature, which does exist conventionally. So in that sense, a conventional dispute can overcome another conventionally existent dispute. So here we have the picture here in the Buddha teaching. The idea is that the Buddha appeared in the world in according to worldly convention. So any of you who were here for the 70 stanzas course, that's what the entire text is about. The first stanza of the text so is that talking about things abiding or not abiding, or existing or not existing, or being born or ceasing. It says the Buddha taught in worldly terms, he didn't teach authentically. So all of those are just the Buddha teaching according to the way things appear to ordinary people. It's not according to his own appearance, the way things appear from his perspective. So the Buddha appears in the world and then teaches based on, it says, if the Buddha appears in the hungry ghost realm, he teaches in the hungry ghost language. If he appears in the human realm, he teaches in the human language. And if he appears in a barbarian land, it says, then he teaches in the barbarian language. But we can understand that to mean whatever country he appears in, he teaches in that language, not just that language in terms of the vocabulary, but that particular way of viewing things. He doesn't dispute with the world, it said, that people have a particular framework for understanding, and the Buddha works within that, rather than saying immediately your entire framework for seeing things is incorrect, which is ultimately the teaching. It starts within this particular framework. So you have these 5 disciples of his, the first 5 disciples, who were trying to achieve a particular goal. So rather than immediately saying this goal you're seeking is empty, he said, well, that's the goal you want. Here's how you get there. I'll teach you that. And then gradually they come to understand even more deeply that in order to really reach that goal, this is what the 60 stanzas text is about. You have to get out of the entire framework of thinking of somebody who's a real person trying to achieve a real goal. Because that in and of itself, that wrong view, is what's obstructing you from achieving what you think you want to achieve. So on the right-hand side here, again, this is borrowing from Westerhoff. He gives an exceptionally good example, I think, of how one wrong view stops another wrong view, so here we have an illusion. So some of you might know there's an illusion of somebody wearing vertical stripes will appear to be taller than somebody wearing horizontal stripes. But then we have what's called an Ames room, which is a room that's designed in a way that makes it look like one person is taller than another. So actually these women are the same height, actually probably the same person, I'm not sure, but generally speaking, if you had 2 people in a room, in this room, one would look taller than the other when they're actually the same height. So you take these 2 women, imagine putting somebody in the Ames room wearing vertical stripes, another person wearing horizontal stripes, then they would look like they're the same height, because there's 2 illusions and they counteract each other. So this is like the Buddha's teaching. The Buddha, whatever extreme we're going to, the Buddha then corrects that by giving the opposite extreme. So again, maybe it's like wearing glasses. If you don't need glasses and you wear them, then things will not look correct because your vision isn't impaired. But if it's impaired, you correct it a particular way. So the Buddha's teaching is like that it just gives the right tweak to bring us our vision back to the way it should be. So we have a non-veridical perception needed be stopped by a veridical one, which is what the opponent thinks. If you're going to stop a true existence, you have to have something that's truly existent to stop it. Rather, a second non-veridical perception can correct the first one. And then Nagarjuna responds again to this analogy of sound. This is his other way of responding. So first he responded conventionally. This analogy doesn't work, that it's not similar to what I'm doing. But then he responds from the ultimate perspective, because if you remember, the person said, here, a pre-existing sound, which by that he means a truly existent sound. So then he says, or your analogy remains something to prove since there's no sound. We from our side don't verbalize without accepting worldly terms. So actually, when you say that according to your analogy, a real existent sound negates another one, that's not right. Just like my statement, the words don't make a sound are also empty. So you are wrong to say a pre-existing sound prevents another one. So we from our side don't verbalize without accepting worldly terms. Again, that we function within the constructs of the world. We don't just say that nothing exists and no words are right or wrong. We agree, okay, we have a system of logic and we're all agreeing on that. Now let's work within that. So I'm not going to step out of that and just say, your words have no inherent existence. That's the ultimate perspective, but that's not valid within a particular argument. So if we want to argue, we're arguing, for example, a mathematical equation, and I say to you, what is the answer, this or that? And you say, well, it's neither because it's all empty. Well, yes, ultimately that's true, but that isn't answering the question. It's not within the framework. So ultimately, yes, my words are empty, your words are empty, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about which ones conventionally are more in tune with the way things exist on the conventional level. So next we have the final dispute of this first section, the no thesis view, which I mentioned is the most important part here. So I'll have a significant digression about this. So then the opponent says, negation of negations like that, accepting this is just as crass. The features of your thesis create a fault like this for you, not me. So it's not totally clear what he's saying here. It seems like he could have one of two meanings. So one is that interpretation A, this is, again, he's saying, Nāgārjuna, you could respond to me like that. So in quotations is the opponent saying, maybe, Nāgārjuna, you would say to me, negation of negations like that. Whereas the Nāgārjuna would respond, just as my words are empty, so are yours. So if I can't negate a nature, you can't negate me. So it's sort of this childish way of seeing it, that the person says, well, your words are empty, they can't do anything. And Nāgārjuna says, well, your words are empty too, so they can't harm me either. So this is sort of a circular, but goes back and forth. Okay, so then he goes, oh, your words are empty, your words are empty. So this is one way of seeing it. It's sort of, more coarse, we might say, a more coarse way of understanding what's being said. But the other interpretation is more subtle, that if you reject our realist semantics, us Nyāyas, can you posit functional semantics within a completely relativistic world, right? So if you say that that there's no real thing that's being referred to by terms, and that your realist semantics, which assumes that everything that is said refers to or one real thing that corresponds to it in the world, then if you just have a completely relativistic world, can you posit semantics that function? Can you, because this features of your thesis saying that everything is empty create a fault for you, Nagarjuna. For me, as a Nyāyā, it doesn't create a fault because my negation is not like that. I have a system of logic that's sound within my system. So again, borrowing from Westerhoff, these examples of first monopoly money, right? So monopoly money doesn't have any real correspondence to anything. It's not worth anything. For money to be worth something, it has to correspond to value in the world. It has to have some kind of, originally anyway, money corresponded to the gold standard. And nowadays it's a little different, and it's more like monopoly money, except that it's still valuable in as much as it functions within our whole system. Whereas monopoly money is not like that. So no matter how much monopoly money I present to you, it's not going to, I can't buy any amount of real money with the monopoly money, except maybe that the monopoly board set is worth something, but that's a different question. Generally speaking, if the realist semantics are like real money and Nagarjuna's relativistic semantics are like monopoly money, it has no effect. It can't do anything. You can't, no matter how much logic you accumulate, it won't affect me. The other example given is, we say the number 2, red 2. So if Nagarjuna argues back to you, to the Nyāyā, no, this is green, it's not red. So one way to respond to that would be to say, no, you're wrong, it's red. But another one would be to completely go out of that system and say, it's not green or red, it's a number, it's not a color. So this could be taken either way, that this is what the Nyāyā is saying to Nagarjuna, or it's what Nagarjuna is saying to the Nyāyā, which is, although the Nyāyā thinks this is how he wants to negate Nagarjuna, this is really the essence of Nagarjuna's argument, that your entire system makes certain assumptions that I don't hold. So I don't have to work within your system. If you try to ask me, is this red or green or blue? I say, it's none of them. It's not a color, it's a number. So your entire system doesn't work for me. But then what system do I posit? So then he responds with the no thesis view. If I had any thesis at all, then yes, it's true, I'd have this fault. Because I have no thesis at all, I'm absolutely free of fault. So this you see here, the arrows missing the target. He's saying every fault you've tried to project on me does not hit the mark because it's going around and around. I didn't accept any of these things that you accuse me of. So the features of my thesis do not create a fault for me because my thesis is not established by way of its own features. More importantly, nor have I adhered to any position of inherence, right? So I haven't accepted that, if, for example, he gave that 6-point argument earlier. I didn't accept any of except for number 5, where I accepted that, yes, my argument is empty, yet it's causally efficacious. The other points, I don't accept the assumptions underlying them. So my thesis can't be harmed by any argument you make. It's like somebody within a board game trying to argue, against the person who's playing the game, as if that person really is the pawn that he's controlling in the game. I'm not playing by your system. I'm not playing your game. So anything you say, your assumption that everything that's causally efficacious has to be inherently existent, then if you argue with me one with this or that, none of those work because I don't hold that assumption. If some statements had realist semantics and some only conventional, then the conventional could not refute the realist. Then such a fault would apply. So this is the problem, that the Nyāyā is assuming that Nagarjuna agrees in realist semantics because he thinks that's just axiomatic. In his view, if anything is true or false, then there has to be realist semantics. There has to be a real correlation in the world. In which case, if you then say there's conventional semantics, what you talk about, they have no efficacy. They can't affect the realist semantics, just like monopoly money can't counter real money. But I never said that, Nagarjuna says. I never said that I accept realist semantics. Everything is conventional, your words and mine. So they don't have to be functioning within this. So this comes again to an example. Now you see that before I go to the next slide, I've put this statement in bold, because again, this is probably the most important stanza within the text. It's argued over endlessly by different Buddhist interpreters. And so some of them certainly interpret this to mean that there is no thesis. What does it mean to have no thesis? And some people argue that Nagarjuna said, I don't have any position in anything. All the MADHYAMAKA school is meant to do is to tear apart other people's arguments without actually positing anything. Now, this is not Tsongkhapa's interpretation, and it doesn't appear to be Chandrakirti's interpretation, but I think most of the rest of the talk today will be discussing a digression about what this means. But first, just to give an example that might make this easier. Again, Westerhoff gives some very good example. This is why I said I recommend his book. So he gives the idea, conventional rules cannot override realist ones. So imagine that we have real inherent rules. So thou shalt not kill. So these are the commandments. Imagine these exist beyond any particular way of seeing things. These are just the way things are. It's wrong to commit murder. It's not based on the law of a particular land. It's just an inherently wrong action. Whereas we have driving on the left side of the road. In certain countries, that's correct. In certain countries, it's incorrect. It's a relativist thing. It just depends on how we frame what's right and wrong. So if somebody then were to drive on the left side of the road, and then, oh, there's somebody in the road in front of me, and you just run straight over him. And they ask you in court, why did you do that? And you said, well, I was just following the rules. I didn't want to drive on the right side of the road and avoid hitting this person. But you would still go to jail, because it would just be assumed that this rule of not killing is more real than the rule of the road. That this is an inherently bad thing, whereas the rule of the road is only bad in relation to a particular set of specular paradigm, which we all agree it's perfectly fine to step out of that paradigm in order to stop doing something inherently bad. But the thing is that in Nagarjuna's philosophy, it's not like this. All the rules are relativist. Now, does this mean, this is the question, does this mean that he would say that murder is not wrong? This is also a debate that's often made. Now, certainly, according to Buddhist philosophy, murder is what we call a naturally bad action, versus some actions are only considered bad by prescription. That the Buddha said, don't do this, so it's wrong to, at least for a monk, to go against that rule because it's a rule that the Buddha set down. So, for example, monks are not meant to eat in the evening. There's nothing inherently wrong with doing that, but because it's the rule set by the Buddha, then it becomes negative action for a monk to eat in the evening because it's going against the Buddha's instructions. But certainly, if somehow your not eating in the evening was going to cause the death of somebody, then there's an exception. It's a natural going against the prescribed negative action is outweighed by a naturally negative action, and so it's more important not to kill somebody than to worry about whether or not you eat in the evening. But does that mean it is inherently bad? This is different. So it's still, when we talk about murder being wrong, it's wrong in as much as, generally speaking, if somebody murders somebody, it will have a negative impact because they will almost certainly be motivated by a negative mind of anger, a mind of attachment. Now, again, we might want to say, well, that's all relative too. But at a certain point, we could say, okay, well, if you feel that you're so beyond this system that it doesn't matter to you anymore, then I can kill you too, and maybe you won't care. But for most of us, we're not at that point. So maybe at the ultimate level, we can understand this is all just dreamlike. But in the conventional level, we have to be very careful not to overestimate our level of realization, and also to be aware of the impact it will have on others. It's that the more you understand emptiness, the more careful you are in your actions, because you recognize that everything will have an impact. This is not negated by emptiness at all. But it is the point that what that result is never fixed. You can never say for sure. So even then, there might be particular cases where it might be actually more morally correct to kill somebody. It's very rare and it's very dangerous in some sense to hold that view, to think that, oh, I'm justified at what I'm doing because this is saving so many lives. But generally speaking, it's not necessarily good or bad. It really depends on the motivation and the result. But unless we are very clear, we know what our motivation is and we know the result, it's very hard to predict that. So in the vast majority of situations, these are considered naturally bad actions. So here's a response then. This is actually a response to the argument against constructivism that I presented earlier by the Western philosopher. which is related to what Nagarjuna is saying, just saying it in a more modern language. So if you can prove that all truths are relative, then saying that your thesis of universal relativity is merely relative will not detract from it. Rather, the question becomes, why should this relative truth be adopted rather than another? So this, I think, is a very relevant and powerful response. Okay, so I said all truths are relative. So yes, it's true. What I just said is also not absolutely true. But there might be certain things that are more useful to adopt than others. So this is actually the approach of science. This is why I think actually MADHYAMAKA philosophy works very well with science. That it's saying that we can adopt, okay, here we have a particular paradigm that works better with the evidence we have. We accept that it might be supplanted in the future. If we gain more evidence, it might be the case that we can't ever adhere and say this is absolutely true. I'm never changing my view, which is generally how religion is understood. A lot of people think, a lot of people in the modern world say they don't accept religion because religion is just based on adhering to one doctrine and refusing to modify it, which often happens, and it even happens with Buddhists, and it even happens with people who claim to be Madhyamakas, that if we get too attached to one particular view, then we can't actually, the point of a framework is to help us make sense of the world that we live in and the experiences we have. But sometimes that framework then actually takes over and it prevents us from seeing the way things are because we're too attached to our particular way of seeing things. So this is what Madhyamaka is trying to get over. Generally, Madhyamaka agrees that the Buddha's teachings were very efficacious and they're probably better to be adopted. But if we get too attached to them as an absolute truth, then it actually can become dangerous because it stops us from the whole point of the Buddha's teaching was to lead us to a place where we can see things more in the way that they actually are, rather than how we believe them to be. Now, in science, the idea is that we continuously build upon old ways of seeing things and gain more evidence and then gradually modify our theories. So this is why one relative truth can be adopted, but doesn't have to be stuck to forever. As we gain more experience and understand things better, then we can gain a more nuanced way of seeing things. So here we have, I said, digression, the non-thesis view. So I'll explain this, from mainly from the point of view of Tsongkhapa and Chandrakirti, their understanding of what this is meant by having the view of no thesis. So first I'll start, I don't know if any of you know this recent book, it just came out last year, Why Am I Not a Buddhist, which I read recently. Actually, this was an excellent book. I think I would highly recommend it. I've read a number of critiques of Buddhism. This is definitely the best one I've read. Most of the critiques I've read, I find are either naive, whereas the person doesn't really understand what they're arguing against, or are a bit one-sided. They don't really give, they have a particular viewpoint that they're trying to present without really presenting anything that, from my perspective as a Buddhist, really critiques particular views I might hold. Whereas this book is much, this author, Evan Thompson, clearly understands the system quite well and presents a lot of very thoughtful critiques. Although I would say, generally speaking, it seems to me that his critique, and he even acknowledges this to a certain extent, is more a critique of Buddhism as it's understood in the modern world, as opposed to traditional Buddhist philosophy. But still, that's very useful because a lot of us are existing in a modern world, and our way of thinking about Buddhism is very much influenced by that. However, there was this one point in the book where I was kind of surprised that he said this what I've quoted here, because he did actually study Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy, at least at undergraduate. He was a student of Robert Thurman when Robert Thurman was at Amherst College before he came to Columbia University. Amherst College is west of Boston, America. and he studied Nagarjuna and Tsongkhapa's philosophy, and he read this text, Essence of Eloquence, that I mentioned earlier. And so he says here in his introduction to Why I'm Not a Buddhist, is in Essence of Eloquence, Tsongkhapa defends the Prasangika Madhyamaka viewpoint, according to which all phenomena lack defining characteristics, even conventionally, and only negative reductio ad absurdum arguments, rather than positive reasonings, syllogisms, should be used to establish that phenomena are empty of inherent nature. So certainly these two points he's made, what I have in red and what I have in yellow, these are both common understandings of Madhyamaka. A lot of people interpret Nagarjuna this way. But what's strange, and I don't know if I'm misunderstanding what he's saying, because he clearly studied this text. Both of these points are things that Tsongkhapa, within the text Essence of Eloquence, goes to great lengths to say this is a wrong interpretation of Nagarjuna, especially the one in yellow. At least 2 full chapters of the text specifically negate this and actually present very explicitly that the idea that positive reasoning syllogisms is not Madhyamaka philosophy. This is presented as a wrong view. Some Tibetans say this, and here's why it's wrong, and he goes on for many pages to show why that's wrong. So I'm really not sure, because as I said, this is the only point in the book where I get the impression he misunderstood something, as far as I can tell. Generally, he seems to have a good grasp of Buddhist philosophy, but this is very useful to highlight, because it shows a lot of people hear this, that there's no thesis view, and think that therefore the Madhyamaka view is that you only, especially the Prasangika, which means the consequentialist, that you can only present consequences. You hear somebody say something, and therefore you present the contrary to that, such that they're left with no view at all, because every view is wrong. So you always just bring them back by whatever view they present. You then present the opposite, and they're brought back to no view. As opposed to that you actually have your own system, your own thesis, which is what Tsongkhapa says Nagarjuna has and Chandrakirti has. And that, so the idea that when it's called the consequentialist school, that's what's meant. And Tsongkhapa disagrees with that. He says that the reason we call this consequentialist is twofold. One is that based on Buddha Palita's commentary on root wisdom, whenever he presents an argument of Nagarjuna, for the most part, he presents them in the form of consequences. So he likes to use consequences, and generally Chandrakirti also does. They like to argue this way. And secondly, it's related to a particular issue relating to how we argue for that verse that I gave earlier about things that aren't born from self or other or both or neither. And the way that Buddha Palita presents it versus the way that Bhavaviveka argues against it and says that that's not a good way to present what Nagarjuna was saying. And that argument is very much about the use of consequences. So because that particular argument becomes a major distinction, because then Chandrakirti comes back and goes on and on about how Bhavaviveka, because he made that argument, it shows he has a wrong view. And I'll explain that in a minute. That becomes the central divide between the two schools. And so it's identified as a separate school because of that argument. But it's not saying that they do not accept syllogisms. It's not saying that they do not accept that you can use positive reasoning to establish things. And I'll show examples of that. So first of all, to respond to Thompson, these two things. So first he said in red, what is it? That all phenomena lack defining characteristics, even conventionally. Now this, I'm not really sure what he was trying to say. But so what we say in the Madhyamaka view is that everything is not established by way of its own characteristics, which is different than saying things lack characteristics. So Tsongkhapa says specifically in this text where he's saying he said that, Tsongkhapa says, in the text of the logicians, which means like Dharmakirti's text specifically characterized, which is in Tibetan, it actually says established by characteristics, specifically characterized, refers only to what is able to perform a function. So that's one use of that term. In the Abhidhamma Sutras and so forth, specific characteristics are the uncommon features of something that distinguish it from other things, like the heat of fire. So this seems to be what Thompson is interpreting it to mean. But then Tsongkhapa says, the specifically characterized of the phrase established by way of its own characteristics means something completely different. So Nagarjuna is not negating that heat is a characteristic of fire on a conventional level. What he's negating is that things are established by way of their own characteristics, which is a totally different question. I won't explain all of that now because that's the whole point of this text, to explain what it means to be established or inherently existent, established by way of its own characteristics. But it's not saying that conventionally certain things have certain qualities and certain things have other qualities. But the more important point is this question about syllogisms. So as I said, Tsongkhapa goes over this again and again, but just to give two quotations, Tsongkhapa says, Chantakirti explains the meaning of Nagarjuna's phrase, no standpoint, specifically quoting this quote from Dispelling Disputes, to mean that he does not have an opinion of establishment by way of its own characteristics or inherence. And he goes on to say, not to say he means he has no standpoint whatsoever on a conventional level. And later in the same text, he says, thus to state, reason merely negates inherent existence, but does not establish lack of inherence, right? So it negates one view, but does not then propound a view of emptiness or say that I agree things do not have an inherent existence. Does not appear to be the approach of anybody, be they Madhyamaka or logician. Meaning that you Tibetans who consider that to be the Madhyamaka viewpoint, actually nobody in India thought that way. That's a misinterpretation of their texts. So then the question is, if that's not what they meant, and again, as I said, there are people in Tibet even who had that view. Obviously, Tsongkhapa is negating them here, but there are, if you look at, for example, the Sakya school, it tends to be more it tends to adhere more to that position, that our way of no particular statement we can make can ultimately express how things are. So the conventional words can't really express emptiness as it is. It's only something we can realize directly, ultimately, through negating our wrong views. So it's not that nobody in Tibet said that, but to say that Tsongkhapa says that is clearly wrong, because Tsongkhapa is saying people who say that are wrong, and he's saying the opposite. So how does Tsongkhapa understand this? So next, just to show some examples. So does the system not use syllogisms at all? Well, here we have this very first verse of root wisdom. Not from itself, no other nor, from both of them, nor causelessly. No thing at all in any way is ever born at any time. So actually, this is a syllogism, although it's written in a bit of an awkward style because it's a poetic verse. This is how it's understood to be interpreted. This is how the Gaelic school would interpret this verse, if you want to put it in the form of a syllogism. The subject a sprout, it is not truly born, because it is not born from self, from other, or both, or causelessly. For example, an illusion. So this is what we call a philosophical syllogism, right? If it was a consequence, it would say the subject a sprout, it follows that it is not truly born because such and such. But here it's saying it is not truly born, which is a different way of expressing it, which is called a syllogism, which means that it's expressing this is something that we can accept as a probandum, something to be proved. So therefore, as a result of using this reason, somebody would then generate an inferential cognizer that realizes that the subject sprout is not truly born. So it's an inferential cognition of emptiness, which is what the other schools who say that you don't have any thesis would also say that you can't have an inferential cognition of emptiness. You can only have a direct perception because no inference can understand emptiness as it is. Tsongkhapa says that's not how it is, that you can understand emptiness through inference. And then when it says in sutras that emptiness is inexpressible, what it means is that you can't the way it's experienced directly can't be put into words. The same way that we cannot expressed to somebody who's never tasted chocolate, you can't just use words to describe what chocolate tastes like. It's not really going to give them that experience. However, you can use reasoning to infer about it and gain wrong or right views about it. So I can at least tell you, well, tasting chocolate is a sweet taste. So you realized it's more like tasting sugar than like tasting salt. And you can gain one view is right and one is closer to the way it is. You can also express that there is a taste called chocolate, and it arises from putting chocolate against your tongue and so forth. You can have all kinds of statements about it that you can infer about it. It doesn't mean that you know exactly what it's like to taste it, but you get much, much closer to the truth. Next, we have Chandrakirti. So this is explicitly a syllogism, even more so than Nagarjuna, because Chandrakirti, in his text, which is supplement to the middle way, so it's meant to just explain more clearly the meaning of Nagarjuna's text. He goes through all these 4 points, negating birth from self, birth from other, from both, from neither. And at the end of that, as a summary, he says, because. He doesn't say it follows. So against people who say that Chandrakirti never uses because statements, he only uses follows. He says, because they're not born from themselves or other or both, or not without a cause, all things are natureless. And just, again, this is still in verse. As I said, I try to put things in verse, but Chandrakirti uses a very complex system of verse. So I think this is what we'd call, I think, hexameter in English. It's not like the other verses, which are more simple, but it's still written in verse. But then we have Gyawa Gendon Drup, the first Dalai Lama, who wrote an excellent text called A Mirror Clarifying the Supplement. So he takes every verse from Chandrakirti's text and then puts it in the form of either a syllogism or a consequence to make it clear, because Chandrakirti is writing in verse, to make it more clear what he's saying in plain, simple language. So for some verses, he puts them in the form of a consequence, but here he puts it in the form of a syllogism. What is this verse saying? The subject, all things. They are free of inherent nature because they do not exist from having been born from self, from other, or both, or without relying on a cause. So this is a syllogism, it's not a consequence. And likewise, I hold to no extreme. So now we'll get more into, well, how is this all relevant? Why does it matter? So again, Chandrakirti is saying that somebody accuses him because Chandrakirti says, if things were inherently born, this is another kind of argument, then either the cause would have to meet the result or not meet it, or both or neither. Meaning that you have to say, if you have a seed in a sprout, you'd have to point to, here's the seed and here's the sprout, and they touch, they're meeting each other. It's like this example I gave of baking a cake. If you're inherently baking a cake, well, where's the cake that you're baking? There isn't really anybody doing anything to anything. It's our mind creating a framework. We connect the dots. There's no cake here that I'm making. It exists somewhere in the future, which in that sense, it only exists in my imagination. But I'm connecting the dots between a past experience and a future experience and saying, I made a cake. I think eventually that's true. But ultimately, if it was really inherently true that I was making a cake, you'd have to be able to show the cake and me as two objects in a non-relativistic framework that are touching each other, that are relating in some way, and that doesn't work. But if they were inherently real and they met, then they'd exist at the same time, so they couldn't be cause and effect. But if they were inherently real and they did not meet, then they would have no effect on each other. So you couldn't have cause in either way. So somebody turns it around on Chandrakirti and says, well, you say that your words refute mine, but do they meet my words or not? So they use the exact same reasoning back on him. So he again responds to this in verse. Does refutation meet refuted to refuted or? Do they not meet? Statements like this surely turn to false. For contesters with a standpoint, as for me, I don't have a standpoint. consequences don't apply to me. So it's very similar to Nagarjuna's response. I don't have a standpoint. But what he's saying is, I don't have any opinion. That's not the point. The point is, in my system, there's no inherent framework. So in order for my words to refute your words, they do not have to either meet or not meet or both or neither. Because that's only a problem within an ultimate non-relativistic framework of things. So when I say I don't have a standpoint, it means I don't hold to any extreme. I don't say things are born from self. I don't say things are born from other. I don't say things are born from both. I don't say things are born from neither. Because all of those are only extremes within your framework. It's not that I'm not saying things aren't born, but I don't have to choose any of those four options. And I don't have to choose any of the four options about refutation. Does it meet or not meet? If I believed in inherent existence, I would have to choose one of those options, in which case these consequences would apply. So then we have this question of commonly appearing subjects, which, let's see, how much time do we have? So we're getting close to the end here. So this is, I think, I'll try to just go through this briefly. And this is a very deep subject that certainly I would take an entire course to really understand what's being talked about here. But just to give an idea of it, and as I said, this is the distinction between the Bhavaviveka's school of autonomous, we call the autonomist middle way, Savatantrika Madhyamaka, versus the Chandrakirtis, the consequentialist. So the entire dispute that distinguishes these schools comes from this verse of Nagarjuna that I just quoted. This not from itself, nor other, nor from both, nor causelessly, no thing at all, at any time, in any way that you're born in any time. So Buddha Palita, then in his commentary on that, he just says, how do I explain this in prose language, in simple, not in a verse, but in simple language? He says, things are not born from themselves. So this is the first point, right? They're not born from self, other, both, or neither. It's only relating to this first point that this dispute comes up. How do you make a syllogism or a consequence that negates birth from self? So he says, things are not born from themselves, because if they were, then they would always be born. There would be no point in them being born. There would be no point in them being born, and they would continuously always be born. So it's a consequence. It's not actually a syllogism. So to put that in the form of a consequence, it would be the subject a sprout. It follows that there is no need for it to be born again, because it is already established by its own nature. So you see a sprout here underground. What would be the point of it being born if it's already a sprout? So birth would be pointless. This is the point. The consequence is that birth would be pointless. And this is what Bhavaviveka argues against, that saying that consequence does not negate the person's wrong view. And basically he gives three reasons, but the third reason he gives is that the person who is really a Samkhya school is the ones who accept birth from self, could respond to you that, okay, you said the subject is sprout. What do you mean by sprout? Do you mean the sprout that exists at the time of the cause, or do you mean the sprout that is already manifest? Because in their system, at the time of the seed, there's a non-manifest sprout that's waiting to be born. And then at the time of the sprout, it manifests, it appears to us, but it already existed in a non-manifest way at the time of the seed. But you have to be clear what you mean by sprout. If you mean the sprout that existed in a non-manifest way at the time of the seed, then I would say no pervasion. It does have to be born again, because it exists in a non-manifest way, but it has to manifest. If you mean the sprout that exists in a manifest way at the time of the sprout, then I would say the pervasion Oh, sorry. I would say that in this case, I accept. So the first one, I would say actually it's opposite. If it follows that there's no need for it to be born again, I would say the opposite is true. It does need to be born again. Or if you say at the time of this sprout, does not need to be born again, then I would say, yes, I agree. There's no problem with that. So you haven't said anything that I disagree with. So this fails to negate the person's wrong view. So Chandrakirti then comes back later and defends Buddhapalita against Bhavaviveka's attack. And in the context of this particular point about what is the subject, what Chandrakirti argues, Tsongkhapa says this is the most subtle argument. If you look at Chandrakirti's arguments for emptiness against Bhavaviveka, all of them are profound, but among these, this is the most profound. He's saying that you're Bhavaviveka because you said that. It shows that you assume that there's a commonly appearing subject. That when we talk about anything, it's referring to a real thing in the world that we both already agree upon. Whereas that doesn't have to be the case, because there is ultimately no commonly appearing subject, although conventionally there can be among people who agree on certain parameters. Even then, there doesn't have to be. That I can argue with somebody and we can have a completely different idea of what we're talking about, but still my argument can be effective. So this is related specifically to this question of, what do words refer to? This person arguing against Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna does not think words have to refer to anything, yet still you can argue about things. So when the person said, when Buddhapalita says the subject is sprout, so we have in brackets, this is how it appears to the Samkhya. The sprout that exists in a non-manifest way at the time of its cause. So I'm not saying either the sprout, the non-manifest sprout, or the manifest sprout. I'm just saying sprout. How do you think a sprout exists? And in his system, the Samkhya system, it both exists in a non-manifest way and it exists at the time of the result as a manifest sprout. That's the problem, is that your idea of a sprout doesn't work. So then if you have that idea in your mind, it follows that there is no need for it to be born again because it is already established by way of its own nature. And then in his mind, there's the example, the sprout, which is already manifest. So although you didn't say one sprout or the other, it's going to make the person think, well, okay, I talk about a manifest sprout and I talk about a non-manifest sprout. Are they both sprouts? If they are, then the non-manifest sprout also has to have been born from a seed, right? That's what I think of a sprout as. In that case, it also shouldn't be born again. Or maybe it wasn't born from a seed, but then in what sense is it a sprout at all? So my whole idea of a sprout doesn't work logically. But Chandrakirti says you don't have to actually accept that idea yourself. I don't accept that a sprout exists in the way that a Samkhya does, but I can use what's called inference renowned for another. That within their system, I can enter into their system and argue within it without actually accepting it. So one example of this would be, no need for a commonly appearing subject if I wanted to argue with somebody who believes in a creator God. Now, I don't have to accept God, and it doesn't really matter how they believe God to exist. So they could think God is this man in the sky, very sort of, we say, childish view of God, or they could have a much more subtle view of God, where God exists as this divine principle that can't be pinpointed in a material way. But in any case, if they say that God is all loving and God is omniscient and God is omnipotent, then I can give them this consequence. The subject, God, it follows that he is not all loving. Because he is omniscient and omnipotent, yet there is still suffering in the world. So all I've done I don't really think God is omniscient or omnipotent or all loving. I don't accept God in the way you do. Maybe I don't accept God at all. It doesn't really matter to me how you accept God. But whatever subject you want to give, whatever appears to your mind, this consequence is going to come about. If you say that he is omniscient, omnipotent, and you know there's suffering in the world, then how can he be all-loving? This, of course, many of you know, is a major debate within Christianity. Many people have come up with all kinds of ways to try to get out of this debate and explain it. But for a lot of people, this is why they end up leaving Christianity, because it's just too hard to reconcile these things. If God can create everything and can control everything, why does he create suffering? What's the point? Especially, if you think that, okay, well, at least he's giving this as a way to test me. But in a traditional Christian view, which a lot of liberal Christians these days don't accept, we have hell, whereas people are damned for eternity. So what would be the point of God creating souls just to send them to hell? This seems to be a very strong consequence of that view. But the point is, I don't have to accept this subject. It can just be something that I throw a consequence without accepting the subject. Now here, I've given a very long explanation, which I think I just put it in here if people want to look through it. And I'll read through it very briefly, in the hope that maybe it will have, it's worded in a way that's coherent. So dependent arising constitutes three levels of subtlety: dependence on causes, dependence on parts, and dependence on label and consciousness. All Buddhist schools other than the Middle Way school consider dependent arising to mean only dependence on causes, and furthermore consider that because functioning things arise in dependence on causes, they must be truly existent, right? So dependent arising implies true existence, because there's things that arise from causes. It doesn't matter how we think about them. The Middle Way autonomy schools considers that dependent arising can also mean dependence on parts, and that because things depend on their causes and they are not in their parts, they are not truly existent. Because if they were truly existent, they would have to be partless. Something that's truly existent, they would say, is either truly existent one or truly existent many. Just like anything that exists is either singular or multiple. And if it's truly existent one, then it can't depend on parts, because it exists as one in and of itself, no matter how you think about it. So this is what Bhavaviveka uses as one reasoning. For the Middle Way consequence school, all phenomena also dependent arising, that they depend on labeling consciousness and are therefore empty of inherent existence. So then a question arises as to whether the autonomy school also posits that things depend on labeling consciousness. Certainly some of their text, especially Kamalashila, is illuminating the Middle Way. So Kamalashila was another scholar of the autonomy school after Bhavaviveka, clearly state that phenomena exist through the force of appearing to a non-defective awareness. So it sounds like they are posited by thought. However, a non-defective awareness is understood to be a consciousness that unmistakably cognizes the conventional mode of abidance of its object. So this is the important point. They say that things exist being posited by non-defective awarenesses. What's a non-defective awareness? It's something that cognizes the conventional mode of abidance, the way something exists. So it's just to relate to a commonly appearing subject, something that we can all agree upon. Ultimately, it's not real, but conventionally, this is what we're talking about. Chandrakirti considers that this very conventional mode of abidance that the autonomists consider essential for existence is actually indistinguishable from true existence, because it implies that something among the bases of designation or the collection of the bases constitutes the object cognized. So Chandrakirti says that although you say it's not truly existent, the very thing you're talking about, this conventional mode of abidance, it's really no different. Although you don't use the word true existence, you're still trying to say that there's some kind of referent to the term that you can locate among the basis of designation that's does not rely on a particular way of framing it or a particular consciousness imagining it that way. So it's the exact same thing. In that regard, you're no different from any other non-Buddhist school or any of the other Buddhist schools, even though you claim that things are not truly existent. Thus, the object exists from its own side, and in such an existence is the very object of negation for the consequence school. Chandrakirti accuses Bhavaviveka, the primary autonomous scholar, of undermining his own purported middle way tenets by insisting on a conventional mode of abidance. to say that, and this is exactly what Bhavaviveka says, things are not truly existent because they only exist through the force of appearing to a mind that cognizes their conventional mode of abidance, is tantamount to claiming things are not truly existent because they only exist to the force of appearing to a mind that cognizes their true existence. So this is a self-contradictory statement. So you're saying that why do things not truly exist? Because they only exist appearing to minds that recognize them for what they really are. So when you say what they really are, you're just saying true existence again. You're saying that the mind that cognizes something that can be found among these bases of designation. So for these reasons, Tsongkhapa and his Gelug followers consider that the third and subtlest form of dependent arising, dependence on a labeling consciousness, is something that only the consequent scholars are able to posit coherently. So again, to try to make this approachable, to make sense in what does this all mean, I like to think of it that, imagine that Bhavaviveka and Chandrakirti were having an argument, or trying to define emptiness. So Bhavaviveka says, okay, first of all, let's define a subject. So let's say we want to prove that a sprout is non-existent. So first of all, let's agree what a sprout is. So we all agree that a thing that arises out of the ground, this stem this stem, and here's the bulb that's at the top of the stem. And these two things put together at this particular time, that's a sprout. That's what we mean by a sprout. Now let's get to work trying to show how it depends on parts and is not truly existent. And then Chandrakirti would say, wait a minute, do you mean, when you say parts of the sprout, do you mean one particular part or all of them put together? And then Bhavaviveka gets a little annoyed and says, I'm talking about all the parts, okay, not just one. I'm talking about all of them put together. And then Chandrakirti says, well, wait a minute. When you say all of them put together, are you saying that it's all of them put together in a particular shape, or before when they were all put? What if you ripped them apart and they were all on the ground at the same parts? And Bhavaviveka would say, well, look, I'm saying at this time, in this shape, in this way, we all agree, okay? Now let's get over that point. And then Chandrakirti will go on and on about this. Well, wait, you say that shape there. So he stops Bhavaviveka at the very first point. As soon as you posit a subject and you say, we all agree this is what we're talking about, then you've already assented to true existence. So any other reasoning you use after that is going to be faulty, because no matter how much you can show that it depends on parts, the very thing you're talking about is not something we can locate in the first place. We can make arguments as long as we agree that the subject is only something relative that where we can't actually define. That's the whole point of what we're trying to prove. So as I said on the first day, some of my teachers at Sarah have pointed out that Bhavaviveka was, it seems like, a Brahmin who was raised in a very traditional atmosphere, and became a monk, but was still very much writing in a very formal way. So he liked to use logic in a very formal way. And so he would get annoyed if Chandrakirti was trying to challenge these things. Whereas Chandrakirti, it seems like he's just arguing semantics. But really, when you gets down to it, Bhavaviveka cannot posit anything in any way that Chandrakirti can't subsequently tear apart and say that that whole system you're using, it can't be established in any basis. So here we have Bhavaviveka. Says that a cognizer that certifies an object must be unmistaken to that object. This is different. So Chandrakirti disagrees with that. It must unmistakably recognize it. If that was not the case, everything would be relative and nothing could be posited as real. That cognizer must identify the object's conventional mode of avoidance. That is, it must recognize how the object actually exists, independent of one's frame of reference, right? So then there's just this question, we often bring this up in debate. How does Bhava-viveka explain that we can remember seeing an illusion? So we see an illusion here. There's two zebras, or maybe one zebra, but the idea is that it's not, it might appear to us in a different way than it exists, so it's mistaken. So it's not certifying anything at all. But at the same time, I can remember seeing it. But Bhava-viveka agrees that you have to recognize something in order to remember it. So other schools, not MADHYAMAKA schools, posit self-cognizers. We'll talk about tomorrow. Yeah, tomorrow. Saying that, well, they address this particular point. If you see an illusion, you're mistaken to the illusion. However, you're not mistaken to the fact that you're experiencing an illusion. That's your self-cognition. It's an aspect of the mind that cognizes itself. So although at one level it's mistaken to the external object, it's not mistaken to the cognition itself. So you can remember the cognition and you can remember the object because you can remember having an appearance of an object, even though you don't recognize the object correctly. Now, Bhava-viveka also does not accept self-cognizers. So in Chandrakirti's system, it's okay. You can both be mistaken to something and recognize it. This is the unique facet of Chandrakirti's system. You can never really recognize something non-mistakenly unless you're having direct perception of emptiness. Everything else is a mistaken cognition. And it's mistaken to the very thing that it's certifying. But at the same time, it can distinguish between right and wrong in a conventional way. So you can recognize this illusion. You don't recognize it, you don't know it's an illusion, but you recognize an object and later you remember it. You don't have to make recourse to a self-cognizer. And I'll show you tomorrow why he thinks self-cognizers are problematic. But in Bhava-viveka system, how do you remember seeing an illusion? So what Tsongkhapa gives, he says maybe he thinks, he doesn't say maybe, but it seems that Tsongkhapa was just hypothetically pointing this out, that in Bhava-viveka's system, that, for example, you have an eye consciousness that sees an illusion. It also sees the background. So you see these zebras on the background of some hills. Then later you come back. So imagine we say illusion here. These are zebras, but imagine it's like a magician's illusion. It's not a real physical thing. It's just a bunch of lights. So then that illusion just disappears. Then you see the background. So you recognize the contrast of the background with and without the appearance, and you recognize there was illusion there. So this is one way that we could talk about it. However, what we then debate, because we always try to extend those reasonings, that doesn't work for a dream. In a dream, there's no background. The whole thing is mistaken. So there's a problem for Bhava-viveka's system. How can you remember having a dream? Because you aren't aware that you're dreaming, because that would be a self-cognizer. You're not aware of the actual consciousness itself. I mean, being aware you're dreaming is a different question. If you like have a lucid dream, but that's something else. But there's no certification of the consciousness. There's only the experience of an object. And you're mistaken to that object, so you can't realize that. So you have no basis for remembering anything because you haven't recognized anything. Whereas in Chandrakirti's system, it's okay because you can still recognize the appearance, even though you're wrong to the appearance. It doesn't have to, in order to recognize something, you don't have to recognize what it really is because it doesn't exist in any real way anyway. All it has to recognize is that there's an appearance to mind. So then I've just quoted Thich Nhat Hanh here, the different subject, but I think because this question of commonly appearing subjects can seem very esoteric, I think to give it a very practical way, which is Thich Nhat Hanh does that very frequently. You know, he is somebody who I think has a very clear understanding of emptiness, but doesn't talk in a very philosophical way. He talks in a very accessible way to people. So this is this is actually something he said to me personally when I asked him a question. I visited Plum Village 18 years ago now, or 19 years ago now. But it's something he's also said in other contexts. But I asked him the question that, because at this time I was a college student, and although I was at a liberal college in the Northeast in America, there were still many fundamentalist Christians there who didn't like that I was a Buddhist, or I don't know if he didn't like, but at least tried to convince me I was wrong. and that I should accept Jesus. And I asked him how would he respond to this. So Thich Nhat Hanh's answer was, even if he said, I would say to such a person, even if I said to you from my heart, I fully accept Jesus, still my Jesus would be different from your Jesus. So I think what he's saying is that somebody who says that the only truth is Jesus, the only way to salvation is Jesus, is therefore assuming that there's a commonly appearing subject. They're assuming that when I say Jesus and you say Jesus, the same thing is appearing to both our minds, and they refer to something real, external to our minds, that we can pinpoint, which is certainly not the case. And Jesus, we could have very different ideas about this. And this is something I think is, when you think about it, what does it really mean to accept Jesus? And I could say, well, I accept Jesus because for me, Jesus means love. And they would say, well, no, but you have to accept Jesus the way I define Jesus. But then well, why does it, the way that you define it can't actually appear to my mind in the same way? It can only appear to our minds based on our own framework. Even if we're using a common language, what appears to my mind is going to be very different based on my own experiences, my own way of having understood the world based on how I've grown up, how I've been educated. And Thich Nhat Hanh also has said in another context, the right view is no view, which I think is very relevant in the context of no thesis. Now, obviously, Thich Nhat Hanh has opinions. He's very vocal about some of his opinions. For example, about his opinion of how the US should have handled the situation in Vietnam. So he wouldn't just say, there's no particular right way to see it. I mean, he would say, in the sense that, yes, there's not one inherently right view that has to be true at all times, but generally speaking, he was very vocal. This war is a mistake, and that the people who are going to war have a wrong view, a wrong understanding of the situation in Vietnam. When he's saying the right view is no view, he's saying that anytime we get too attached to one particular way of seeing things, and don't allow ourselves to be open to new information in any situation, then we fail to adopt our view and to modify our view based on, based on a difference in the conventional world. And Thich Nhat Hanh also talks about ultimate dimension, and he says ultimate dimension versus historical dimension, which is his word for conventional truth. But it's the same idea that on the ultimate dimension, there is a way of seeing things. This is how Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna would agree. The view of emptiness is the true view, is the right view. But as it just said, the view of emptiness. It's not a view of anything in particular in relation to one other thing. Anything that views things in relation to something else can never be the ultimate truth, because by its very nature, it relies on something else, some other proposition, some other way of seeing things. So it cannot be ultimately true at all times from all perspectives. So my understanding of this is what he means by the right view is no view. So then, let's see, how much time do we have? So we're already over time, sorry about that, but we'll just finish quickly. This is just a review for any of you who are there for the 60 stanzas course. I actually mentioned that this stanza of 60 stanzas was something that Nagarjuna covers in much more detail in Dispelling Disputes. So he says, the great ones have, in all respects, no standpoint and thus no disputes. For those who have no standpoint, how could others' standpoints stand for them? So again, he's saying the great ones being Arya beings, who have realized emptiness. In all ways, they have no standpoint, they have no point of view, and there's nothing to dispute with them. So I have the person standing in space, or exploding in space. It's not in relation to anything else. So how can you argue with them? How can you try to say it's this or that, it's this direction, is that direction? There's no direction, just space. So how could they have an argument with anyone? How could they disagree with somebody else's point of view? So then Aryadeva also, in his 400 stanzas, Aryadeva was the main student of Nagarjuna. This is the final verse of the text. Exist or not, or both of them, for one who has no standpoint here, no matter how long they may try, debaters can't dispute with him. Right? So if you don't If you say, does it exist or not exist or both or neither, if you don't take any position, how can anybody prove you wrong? So we have here the Buddha. We see people trying to, in this case, his cousin Devadatta was trying to kill him by releasing a mad elephant. So we see that people became, who argued with him, became desperate. There was no, they couldn't argue with him in a logical way, so they just resorted to trying to kill him. There were people in the Buddha's time, so you might know the famous questions they asked him about, will the Buddha continue to exist when he dies or not, or both or neither? And he didn't answer. Or they said, is the world eternal or not, or both or neither? And he didn't answer. So this is, a lot of people think, does it mean that he didn't know? That's one possibility. Or does it mean that he wasn't going to continue to exist after he died? That's another possibility, that none of those applied to it. So Nagarjuna's understanding, which seems to be supported by the Buddha's own comment to Ananda after he was asked these questions, he said that the problem is that the person asking the question was asking it with a particular framework of understanding. So if you think there's an inherently existent self, then you ask, will the inherently existent self continue to exist after death or not, or both or neither? Then none of those really gets at the truth, because the whole framework of your system is faulty. So none of the answers is going to describe how things really exist. So this comes again to the idea of a commonly appearing subject. The person assumed that when he said Buddha, he was referring to the same thing that the Buddha understood himself to be, which is not the case. So within that framework, none of those answers work. So he didn't take any position. But it doesn't mean that the Buddha didn't, according to Nagarjuna, he talks about this in his text Precious Garland, it didn't mean the Buddha didn't understand what would happen. It actually shows that the Buddha did understand very clearly the psychology of human beings. And he could understand that any of those answers would have led the person in the wrong view. But actually, the Buddha did have a particular understanding of how things existed. It just didn't fit into that person's framework. So that person wasn't ready to be taught. So then again, back to 60 stanzas, Nagarjuna says, right after that one I just quoted, detecting an abode, this snake, affliction slithering poisonous, takes hold of them, but those whose minds have no abodes it cannot seize. So he compares the afflictions like anger and attachment to a snake that's slithering or cunning. It's very cunning that whatever position we take, it will grab a hold of us. So you have to be very careful. If you take hold of any view as the right view, then soon the snake of afflictions will grab hold of you and you'll start generating attachment or you'll start generating anger. So, but those who don't have any position, who don't hold to any inherent position of inherent existence, then the afflictions can affect them. Then he says, again, this was earlier in the text, but it's related to this. It's saying, what happens if you think that things are real, if you take one position? If you accept that things are real, unbearably ferocious views, the cause of hatred and desire will come from these disputes ensue. So as soon as you decide this is the way it is, I've figured it all out, then soon enough you're going to have someone who disagrees with you, and you're going to have to defend your view. We see this happen again and again in the world. I mean, the obvious example is ideologies. People have a particular political viewpoint that they decide this is the absolute way things are, and therefore I'm justified in going to war to defend that, or committing genocide to defend that. But obviously, it's not just something that happens on the grand scale. It happens in life as well, in everyday life, that we have a particular view of things, and we start seeing other people as disagreeing with us or standing in the way of us consummating our understanding in reality. So then we get disputes and we get angry. I'll come back to this point also at the end of the text when I talk about how this can be replied to. Why are these things important? So then then it's dispute 2, epistemology, which definitely I'll leave for tomorrow. This comes back to the Dispelling Disputes text. So we finished the talk for today, and I've already gone over time. So I'm sorry if any of you had to go or were it's causing too much, but I think if people like, we can have a couple of minutes at least for questions, and otherwise we can have questions in the off time. You can obviously continue to send them by email, which might be easier. But if there are quick questions today that are relevant and immediately relevant to what we're talking about, then we can field them. So you can either type them in or just ask.
Tejal, you had your hand up. Do you have a question? I think she left.
Okay.
There's another teaching going on by Geshe Tochi.
Okay, so people have to go, please go. No need to feel you have to stay here. And if no one has a question, then it's perfectly fine. We can, let's say, there's already a few that I have to respond to in the email, so just write them in. And anyway, we'll be meeting again tomorrow, so we'll be going over the questions of epistemology. How do we know what we know? This is the most substantial part of the text.
Hendrik has raised his hand.
Okay.
Please unmute, Hendrik.
Yeah.
Hi, Venerable. Thank you for the teaching.
Yes.
It was one thing that I have a hard time connecting was when you were talking about Bhava Viveka and unmistaken cognizer. You went in a way, in a sense, to disprove that. You went to memory, but I didn't really understand the connection between with memory.
Okay, so let me just say, in our talk tomorrow, this will come very relevant when I talk about self-cognizers. But my point was simply that a question for all the Buddhist scholars is, how does memory function? This is very important for them, not just in a general sense, but also because, of course, a lot of them are talking in the framework of karma. So the function of karma is very similar to the function of memory. They understand these both to be something that existed in the past, thereby manifesting in the present in a certain way. And so both of them have to imply that something happened in the past. There can't just be that the past was all just relative for a lot of them. And so how do you remember anything? So specifically, if I remember something, I have to first experience it. I can't just remember something I never experienced to begin with. So all the different schools give different answers to that. And so the problem is that in Bhava Viveka's system, if I'm mistaken to something, then I don't really recognize it. I can't both recognize it and be mistaken to it. Those are contradictory to each other. So he's saying, but then the problem is that, for example, if I see an illusion, I'm mistaken to it. So in his system, you can't really recognize the illusion. So how do you know you're seeing an illusion at all? How do you know you're seeing anything? So for Chandrakirti, it's different. In Chandrakirti's system, you can both recognize and be mistaken to something, which is actually what we do all the time. Everything we experience all the time is both mistaken and also recognizing things. So there's no problem. But for Bhava Viveka, that's not the case. So then for the case of the illusion, Tsongkhapa suggests maybe he would say that you don't recognize the illusion properly, but you do see the background behind the illusion. And therefore you see that there was once something blocking the background and now there's not. So there must have been something I saw. So then you can remember I saw this appearance, even though you didn't recognize it properly at the time. But then there's the exact question of dreams. So it's not, in Bhava Viveka doesn't actually talk about this. It's just saying that this seems to be a fault in his system, where he agrees that you have to, for one, in order to remember something, you have to first experience something. And then secondly, in order to experience something, you have to be mistaken to it. So then the problem is, how can you remember anything if you're mistaken to it in the first place? But as I say, tomorrow this will become hopefully much clearer, how they describe this in different ways.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay. So could you please elaborate, as soon as you posit a subject, then we have already assented to its true existence. So I said that it's not necessarily the case, but that's often what happens. And it's especially in the case of Chandrakirti arguing with Bhava Viveka. So I mentioned in Chandrakirti's system, to be truly existent means to be inherently existent. which means that you have to locate among the bases of designation something which is the thing. So for example, the table, I gave that example, example number 2, table. You have the legs of the table and the top of the table and the different, there's a couple other parts of the table. So those are the bases of designation. What is a table among those? Is it one of those particular parts, or is it the collection of all of them? And if it's the collection, is the collection that's organized in a particular way? How can you posit that? So Chandrakirti says that any way you posit that is problematic. Ultimately, you really can't posit any of them. You can't really say this is what a table is. We can agree on what a table is. Conventionally, we can say it's a furniture that holds things up. But that's also not really specifying what it is among the bases of designation. So you can't ever actually get into the basis of designation and specify it. But in the Bhava-viveka system, you have to. If you're going to make a philosophical discussion about something, you have to first define what you're talking about. And that means you go within the basis of designation and specify very clearly, this is what is and what is not a table. And this is what we agree on as the referent for the term table. So Chandrakirti is saying that if you then take that as your subject and then try to argue about it, it doesn't matter whatever argument you use, it doesn't matter because you've already decided on something that doesn't exist. You've already assented to it existing among the bases of designation, and therefore you've assented to it being inherently existent. So Chandrakirti says that for ordinary people who don't use philosophy, this is actually not a problem. So generally people, ordinary people, of course, they have the grasping of true existence, but they don't, when they talk about a table, they don't try to specify specifically what they're talking about. So generally speaking, they can have a conversation that doesn't come into any logical problems. They can talk about what table did you build? Can you make me this kind of table, this or that? It's a problem with philosophers who try to define it as being a particular way. And then whatever way they define it, there's some hole in it. So this is actually an issue, within modern philosophy too. So just to give you very briefly, if you're interested, I mentioned Wittgenstein before. This seemed to be the thrust of a lot of Wittgenstein's arguments, that he would say that you can't, when you start out, you can't, as soon as you define something, you can't, you've already taken up an undefendable position. So there's a story, so Wittgenstein was a student of Bertrand Russell, who was a very famous English philosopher, who in a lot of ways, it seems to me, there's the parallel that Russell was very formal. He followed a very formal traditional system of logic, of philosophy. So he was more like Bhava-viveka. And Wittgenstein was, he didn't grow, Russell was also grew up in a very, nobility. Whereas Wittgenstein, actually, his father was a very rich man, but it seems like he was much more identified himself with the common person. He didn't like to present himself as hang out with upper class society or anything like that. So Wittgenstein, he came into Russell's class as a student, a graduate student in philosophy. This was before he was known as a famous philosopher. And on the very first day, Wittgenstein said to Russell, you can't make any statement that's true. And Russell got very angry at him and said, well, I'll make a statement for you. There's no hippopotamus in this room. And then Wittgenstein said, well, what do you mean by hippopotamus? Can you define it in a particular way? And started trying to deconstruct his statement. And Russell then went about looking under the tables. I don't see a hippopotamus here. I don't see one here. Do you see one? So you can see that they were approaching it from a different angle. That Russell had already assented to assuming what a hippopotamus is, and therefore, if it exists, I can locate it in a particular way. Whereas Wittgenstein was trying to point out that when you talk about a hippopotamus already, if you define it in a particular way, no way you define it is going to be stand up to logic. You can always find some kind of problem in that. So this seemed, it's, as I said before, about Wittgenstein that I don't get the impression he was an enlightened being. You know, it's not clear to me that he really was able to translate this philosophy into a way of transforming his mind. And so, you know, in Western philosophy, at least, you know, because I mentioned postmodern philosophers who, in a lot of ways, are following after this tradition of Wittgenstein, like Derrida, some of you might know, where you're just trying to any statement someone makes, you then deconstruct it and show that it's not feasible. You know, there's two extremes to anything. So Chandrakirti is not saying you should never make a statement about anything. You know, he's saying conventionally we can. We have to be very careful that when we talk about conventions, oftentimes underlying it is an assumption that these things exist in a fixed way, in a non-relativistic way. And so we can talk about them, we should talk about them, because there's a very important thing to do, which is to become liberated from samsara. It's not like nothing matters, or it's not like there's no point in talking about anything, and we just enjoy taking apart people's arguments. But the point is that if we want to understand emptiness, we have to be very careful, because if we then start with this whole system of philosophy that we define things in a particular way and then try to talk about emptiness, in some sense we're stopping ourselves at the start line of the race. You know, you haven't even gone over the very first hurdle, which is to let go of this particular way of conceiving things. So he's pointing this out. As I said, in general, he agrees with most of what Bhava-Viveka says. It's not like he just wants to tear apart Bhava-Viveka's system and say everything you say is wrong. Whatever you say, I'm just going to say no. Actually, he agrees with most of his points, but he wants to say, look, I want to make a very important point to you here. The way you're talking, it shows that you have this view. So you have to be very careful of that. Okay. Yeah, so maybe that's good for today. So as I say, yeah, if you'd like, please feel free to write in, and we'll continue tomorrow with the epistemology. So maybe we can do the closing prayers now for those of you who are still here. Okay. May the precious supreme bodhicitta not yet born arise. May that arisen not decline, but increase more and more. Samsara and nirvana lack even an atom of inherent existence, and cause and effect independent arising are unbetraying. I seek your blessings to discern the meaning of Nagarjuna's thought. These two are mutually complementary, not contradictory. However many sick sentient beings there are, may they quickly be freed from all sicknesses. May all sicknesses, without exception of transmigratory beings, never occur again. In all my lives, never separated from perfect gurus, may I endure the magnificent Dharma. And by completing the qualities of the grounds and paths, may I quickly attain the state of Arjadara. By the force of the victorious one, Samkapa, acting as my direct Mahayana virtuous friend in all my lives, may I never turn away even for a second from the pure path highly admired by the victorious ones. May I and all sentient beings meet the teaching of the victorious one, Losang Dragba, who lived an eminent life endowed with pure morality, a brave heart in doing the Bodhisattva's extensive deeds, and the yoga of the two stages, the supreme transcendental wisdom of non-dual bliss and voidness. Like the earth, water, fire, and wind, medicine, and wood in the forest, may I always be enjoyed by sentient beings as they like and without resistance. May I hold sentient beings as dear as my life. May I hold sentient beings hold me most dear. May all their negative karma ripen on me, and my virtue ripen on them. As long as any sentient being is not been liberated from samsara, may I abide in samsara in order to help them, even though I achieve highest enlightenment. May I become like a wish-granting jewel, fulfilling all the wishes, and like a wish-granting tree, fulfilling all the hopes of transmigratory beings. By merely seeing, hearing, thinking about, or remembering me, as well as by touching or talking to me, may all suffering instantly be pacified. May there be happiness forever. Do it all the past, present, and future merits collected by me, the humblest Buddhas and humblest sentient beings, which are completely empty, existing from their own side. May I, who am completely empty of existing from my own side, achieve the state of full enlightenment, which is completely empty of existing from its own side, and lead all sentient beings who are completely empty of existing from their own side. That state, which is completely empty of existing from its own side by myself alone, who am completely empty of existing from my own side. I fully dedicated all these virtues to be able to train just like the hero Jewish who knows reality, and just like the Mandabhata as well. I fully dedicate all my virtues to virtue with the dedication praise is the best, but I'll take on to be on victorious ones with the 3 times in order to have good conduct. For the Dharma King, so encompassed, wave Dharma to flourish, may all signs of obstacles be pacified, and may all conducive conditions be complete. Due to the 2 types of merits of the 3 times of myself and others, may the teachings of the victorious one Losang Drapa shine resplendent forever. Incomparably kind and supreme Tenzin Gache, the source, the granting wish fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world. May you have a long life, and may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Ye who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Nagarjuna's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplished magnificent prayers honoring the 3 jewels, 3 divine ones, may in favor of myself and others your disciples, please live long. Okay, thank you everybody. Hope to see
Thank
you tomorrow.
you, everyone. So the course is likely to be extended, right?
Oh yes, of course. As I said, we have 10 topics. We've gotten through 1 of them. But today's topic and tomorrow's topic are very extensive. So I expect we'll go through epistemology tomorrow, or it might even take 2 sessions. But the remaining topics are all quite short. So I'm hoping we can finish next weekend, but we'll just see how it goes. There's no hurry from my side, and we'll just see. No need to rush through it all. So let's go with what we can do tomorrow. We'll see you then.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you all for participating.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.